A single clue can change everything. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The morning that Mrs. Dolly Bantry attempted to burn the photograph, St. Mary Mead wore its customary expression of gentle respectability, like a maiden aunt who had never entertained an improper thought. The September sun filtered through the diamond-paned windows of Gossington Hall with that peculiar golden quality that transforms even the most ordinary drawing-room into something approaching the sublime. Outside, the last roses of the season nodded drowsily against the stone walls, and somewhere in the distance, the church bells practiced a half-hearted scale that suggested more duty than enthusiasm. In the morning room, however, Mrs. Bantry stood before the fireplace with the expression of a woman who had discovered something unpleasant in her tea leaves. The small fire she had lit despite the mild weather crackled with an almost accusatory cheerfulness, and in her trembling hands she held a photograph that seemed to weigh considerably more than its modest dimensions would suggest. It was not, she told herself firmly, that there was anything particularly shocking about the image itself. The young woman captured in glossy black and white was undeniably attractive, posed on what appeared to be a seaside pier in one of those modern swimsuits that managed to be both modest and decidedly flattering. Her dark hair was swept back by an unseen breeze, and she was laughing at something beyond the camera's range with the sort of uninhibited joy that belonged exclusively to youth and summer holidays. What had set Dolly's hands trembling was not the photograph itself, but the inscription on the reverse, written in a neat feminine hand. "For my dearest George, with all my love, L. June, 1953. George." Her George. Colonel Bantry, justice of the peace, pillar of the community, and a man who claimed he couldn't remember where he'd put his reading glasses, let alone recall the identity of mysterious young women who sent him photographs of themselves in bathing costumes. "Absolute nonsense," Dolly muttered, striking a match with more force than was strictly necessary. "People receive all sorts of peculiar things in the post: advertisements, catalogues, photographs of perfect strangers." The match flared, casting dancing shadows on the morning room walls, and she held it toward the photograph's edge. At that precise moment, the door opened with a sort of timing that suggested either divine intervention or the uncanny ability of servants to appear at the most inconvenient possible moments. "Excuse me, madam," said Mary, the housemaid, "but Miss Marple has called. She wondered if you might be at home to visitors." Dolly started so violently that the match burned her fingers. She gave a small cry, dropped it onto the hearth, and thrust the photograph into her pocket with a movement so instinctively guilty that she might as well have hung a sign around her neck declaring her criminal intentions. "Miss Marple?" she repeated, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "At this hour? Whatever for?" "She said something about the church bazaar committee, madam. Shall I show her in?" Before Dolly could formulate a suitable excuse for unavailability, Miss Marple herself appeared in the doorway, as she had a way of doing when one least expected and most needed her presence. She was, as always, a picture of elderly respectability in her neat grey dress and sensible shoes, carrying a small wicker basket and wearing an expression of gentle concern that immediately made Dolly feel as though she had been caught red-handed in some particularly shameful act. "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said, advancing into the room with her characteristic combination of diffidence and determination, "I do hope I'm not intruding. I was passing by after visiting Mrs. Carmichael. Her rheumatism has been troubling her dreadfully, and I thought I might just inquire about the arrangements for the church bazaar. The vicar mentioned that you had some concerns about the photography display." "Photography display?" Dolly's hand moved involuntarily toward her pocket, then stopped as she caught Miss Marple's mild blue eyes observing the gesture with what might have been casual interest. "Yes, dear. Apparently, several villagers have submitted rather interesting photographs for the exhibition. The vicars seem to think you might have received some correspondence about it." Miss Marple settled herself into the chintz-covered armchair by the window, her keen gaze taking in the hastily extinguished match on the hearth, the faint smell of smoke, and the telltale bulge in Dolly's pocket. "Nothing troubling, I hope?" Before Dolly could answer, the telephone rang in the hall with shrill insistence. They heard Mary's footsteps, her voice answering, and then a long, ominous pause before she reappeared in the doorway, her face pale with excitement and alarm. "Mrs. Bantry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was Mrs. Clegg from the post office. She says there's been a terrible accident. A young woman has been found dead in the old mill pond, and ma'am—" She paused, swallowing hard. "She says the woman was carrying a letter addressed to Colonel Bantry." The silence that followed Mary's announcement stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Dolly found herself gripping the mantelpiece so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, while the photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg with accusatory heat. Miss Marple remained perfectly composed in her chair, though her mild blue eyes had taken on that peculiar sharpness that suggested her mind was already cataloguing facts with the precision of a master librarian. "A letter to the Colonel," Dolly repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What sort of letter?" Mary twisted her apron between nervous fingers, clearly torn between proper discretion and the irresistible urge to share every dramatic detail. "Mrs. Clegg didn't say exactly, ma'am. Only that a young woman came into the post office yesterday afternoon, very smartly dressed, asking for directions to Gossington Hall. Dark-haired she was, wearing one of those modern suits with the narrow skirt. Spoke nicely, educated-like, but Mrs. Clegg thought there was something foreign about her accent." The description hit Dolly like a physical blow. Dark-haired, attractive, well-dressed, it matched the photograph perfectly. She pressed her hand more firmly against her pocket, acutely aware of Miss Marple's gentle but penetrating gaze. The sound of tires on gravel announced Colonel Bantry's return from his morning golf. They heard him in the hall, his voice carrying that particular tone of masculine contentment that comes from a morning well spent among congenial companions. Dolly felt her stomach clench as his footsteps approached. "Ah, Miss Marple." The Colonel entered with characteristic good humor, a tall, ruddy-faced man whose military bearing had softened but not disappeared with age. "Delightful to see you. Come about the church bazaar, I expect." He bent to kiss his wife's cheek, and Dolly forced herself not to flinch. "You look pale, my dear. Not feeling unwell?" "George," Dolly said, her voice sounding strange even to herself. "There's been an accident. A young woman has been found drowned in the mill pond. They say she was carrying a letter addressed to you." The Colonel's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then a frown of genuine puzzlement that seemed almost too perfect in its innocence. "A letter to me, but I don't understand. Who was she?" Miss Marple's knitting needles emerged from her basket with practiced efficiency. "That's what we're all wondering, dear. The description suggests someone quite striking, dark-haired, very well-dressed. Does that bring anyone to mind?" For just a moment, something flickered across the Colonel's face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "I'm afraid that describes half the women in England, Miss Marple. I can't think of anyone in particular." But Dolly, watching her husband with the acute attention born of 25 years of marriage and recent suspicion, saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers gripped the chair back just a fraction harder than necessary. By noon, the news had traveled through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of wildfire. The village, which had been drowsing peacefully in the September sun, suddenly buzzed with electric anticipation. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Price Ridley held court with the authority of an eyewitness. "I saw her yesterday evening," she declared to her captivated audience, "walking up from the station, a flashy sort of creature in high heels, carrying a red vanity case. I said to myself then, that is not a young woman who has come to St. Mary Mead for the scenery. The inevitable gathering point became the vicarage, where tea was, served though nobody paid attention to the scones. Dr. Haydock stood by the mantelpiece, looking unusually grim, twisting his signet ring with nervous energy. Young Basil Blake lounged on the sofa, a cigarette dangling from his lip, his eyes occasionally darting toward the window as if expecting someone. "Drowned, certainly," Dr. Haydock confirmed tersely when pressed, "but there was a blow to the head. Could have been from the stones by the mill. Or from something else entirely," Basil suggested with deliberate provocation. "Perhaps a lover's quarrel?" Miss Marple sat in her corner, needles clicking softly, listening not to the words but to their undertones. She observed the young doctor's tension, Basil's nervous glances, and most particularly Dolly Bantry's repeated gesture toward her pocket. "The poor girl," Miss Marple murmured gently. "No identification, I suppose?" "Just a return ticket to London," the vicar sighed. "And the letter, which the police have taken." "How curious," Miss Marple continued, apparently addressing her knitting, "that a stranger should come to a village where she knew no one, carrying a letter to someone she'd presumably never met. Unless, of course, she wasn't quite the stranger she appeared to be." Her mild gaze swept the room, resting briefly on each face before settling on Dolly with unmistakable compassion. "We must be careful not to let our imaginations run away with us. Though human nature being what it is, the truth is often far stranger than anything we might imagine." The sound of a motor car engine interrupted the speculation, followed by the decisive slam of doors and the measured tread of official feet approaching the vicarage door. Inspector Slack entered the vicarage drawing room with the bearing of a man who regarded village gatherings as deliberate conspiracies against efficient police work. Behind him trailed Constable Lake, notebook at the ready, looking as though he would prefer to be pursuing criminals who had the courtesy to commit their crimes in more straightforward locations than picturesque English villages. "Right then," Slack announced, his voice cutting through the genteel atmosphere like a cleaver through bone china. "I'll need statements from everyone who saw the deceased yesterday, and I'll have them now, if you please. This is a murder investigation, not a social gathering." The word murder fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled company. Dr. Haydock straightened sharply, his professional composure slipping. "Murder, Inspector? I understood there was some question about the cause of death." "Not anymore," Slack replied with grim satisfaction. "The pathologist's preliminary examination shows clear signs of strangulation. The head wound came after, probably from the stones when she was thrown into the pond." He consulted his notebook with theatrical precision. "We've identified the victim as Miss Lydia Vane, age 28, of Kensington, worked as a secretary at the War Office." Dolly Bantry's teacup rattled against its saucer with such violence that Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting with apparent concern. Lydia. The L on the photograph. The pieces were falling into place with the inexorable precision of a clockwork mechanism, each revelation tightening the noose around her husband's reputation. "The letter she carried," Slack continued, his eyes fixing on Colonel Bantry with predatory interest, "was quite specific in its contents. I must see you, George. We cannot let the past stay buried forever." "Ring any bells, Colonel?" The Colonel's ruddy complexion had turned an alarming shade of grey. "I'm afraid I don't recall any Miss Vane, Inspector. The name means nothing to me." "Doesn't it?" Slack's tone suggested deep skepticism. "According to our records, Miss Vane was stationed in Cairo from 1952 to 1953. Same time you were posted there, Colonel. Quite a coincidence." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm, but her mild blue eyes were taking careful note of every expression, every gesture, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence that flickered across the faces around her. Basil Blake, who had been slouching in his chair with studied indifference, suddenly straightened. "I saw her yesterday evening," he said abruptly. "At the Red Lion, around 6 o'clock. She was in the saloon bar, meeting someone in the corner booth. Very cozy they looked too." Inspector Slack pounced on this information like a terrier on a rat. "Meeting someone? Did you see who?" "Couldn't make out the face," Basil replied, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. "But she seemed to know them well enough. I heard her laugh. Distinctive sort of sound, low and rather throaty." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of gentle puzzlement. "How curious, Inspector. If Miss Vane met someone at the Red Lion around 6 o'clock, and her body was discovered this morning, that suggests she spent several hours in the village after her appointment." "What of it?" Slack demanded. "Well," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetically diffident, "Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned that the poor girl was wearing very fashionable high-heeled shoes, and we had that rather heavy shower yesterday evening around 6:30. The path to the mill pond is unpaved clay, dreadfully muddy after rain." She paused, counting stitches. "I was just wondering about the condition of her shoes when she was found." Slack frowned, flipping through his notes with obvious irritation. The shoes were relatively clean, scuffed but not muddy. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Because even if she had walked on the grass verges to avoid the mud, wet grass stains satin shoes quite dreadfully. It suggests, doesn't it, that perhaps she didn't walk to the mill pond at all? The implication hung in the air like smoke from Basil's cigarette. If Lydia Vane hadn't walked to her death, she had been carried there, after she was already dead. Dolly Bantry rose abruptly, her movement so sudden that her chair scraped against the floor. The photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg, demanding acknowledgement, demanding truth. She could feel Miss Marple's compassionate but penetrating gaze upon her, and knew with terrible certainty that her secret would not remain hidden much longer. "Inspector," she heard herself saying, her voice sounding strange and distant, "there's something I must tell you. Something about my husband and Miss Vane. Something I found this morning that changes everything." The words hung in the air, irrevocable as death itself, while outside the vicarage windows, St. Mary Mead continued its peaceful existence, unaware that its tranquil surface had been shattered forever. The silence that followed Dolly's announcement stretched like a taut wire, every person in the vicarage drawing-room holding their breath as she withdrew the photograph from her pocket with trembling fingers. The glossy image seemed to catch the afternoon light accusingly as she placed it on the low table between them, the laughing woman in the bathing suit beaming up at the somber gathering with heartbreaking vitality. "I found this in George's study this morning," Dolly said, her voice barely steady. "Hidden in his old service revolver case. The inscription on the back is dated June 1953, signed by someone who calls herself L." Inspector Slack seized the photograph with undisguised triumph, examining first the image, then flipping it over to read the inscription aloud with grim satisfaction. "For my dearest George, with all my love. L. June, 1953. His eyes fixed on Colonel Bantry with predatory interest. "Care to explain this, Colonel?" The colonel had gone ashen, his military bearing crumbling as he stared at the photograph as though it might bite. "I can explain," he stammered. "Lydia worked in the same office in Cairo. We were colleagues, nothing more. She sent that photograph as a memento from a staff outing to Alexandria. My wife is reading far too much into it." "A memento?" Dolly's voice rose with accumulated tension and betrayal. "A woman doesn't write 'with all my love' as a casual memento, George." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her mild blue eyes studying the photograph with apparent interest. "May I?" she asked gently, and Slack, somewhat reluctantly, passed it to her. She examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands with the delicate precision of someone handling evidence. "How curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "Inspector, I wonder if you noticed the condition of the ink on this inscription? For a photograph that's supposedly been hidden away since 1953, the writing appears remarkably fresh. The ink hasn't faded at all, which one might expect after nearly 20 years. Slack frowned, leaning closer to examine the photograph again. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" I'm suggesting we shouldn't be too hasty in accepting things at face value, she replied diplomatically, especially when they appear so conveniently timed. Basil Blake, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing agitation, suddenly stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "This is all rather convenient, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying an edge that suggested more than casual observation. The wronged lover, the threatening letter, the mysterious photograph. Rather like something from a bad novel. Inspector Slack's attention swiveled toward him with sharp interest. "What exactly are you getting at, Mr. Blake?" "I'm suggesting," Basil replied, his casual tone at odds with the tension in his shoulders, "that a sophisticated woman like Lydia Vane doesn't travel to a village she's never visited without doing her homework first. She would have known who lived here, who might be useful to her purposes." Miss Marple set down the photograph with deliberate care, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "That's a very astute observation, Mr. Blake. It suggests you've given the matter considerable thought. One might almost think you knew Miss Vane yourself." The color drained from Basil's face so rapidly that Dr. Haydock half rose from his chair in professional concern. "I never said I knew her personally. I merely observed her at the Red Lion." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I confess I'm curious how you recognized her distinctive laugh when you claimed you couldn't see her face clearly in that corner booth. Sound does travel oddly in enclosed spaces, doesn't it? Unless, of course, you'd heard that particular laugh before." The trap had been sprung with such gentle precision that Basil found himself caught before he realized the danger. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Miss Marple's deceptively innocent expression, while Inspector Slack moved to block the exit with practiced efficiency. "I think you'd better tell us exactly what your relationship with the deceased was, Mr. Blake," Slack said grimly, "and I'll have the truth this time." Basil's defiance crumbled like wet paper. "All right, yes, I knew her. We met in London last month at a gallery opening. She was asking questions about St. Mary Mead, about who lived here, their histories, their secrets. I thought she was just making conversation, perhaps considering a move to the country." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly younger and more vulnerable. "She mentioned Colonel Bantry specifically, asked if I knew him well, what sort of man he was. When she showed up yesterday, I realized she'd been using me for information." The revelation shifted the room's dynamics like pieces on a chessboard. Colonel Bantry's expression transformed from defensive guilt to something approaching hope, while Dolly's face registered confusion and dawning relief. But Miss Marple continued her steady knitting, her expression thoughtful rather than satisfied, as though this revelation had merely confirmed something she had already suspected, rather than solved the puzzle entirely. Inspector Slack regarded Basil with the expression of a man who had discovered that his supposedly simple murder case was developing the complexity of a Chinese puzzle. "So Miss Vane came here with a specific agenda," he said slowly. "She was investigating Colonel Bantry, using you for background information. What exactly did she want to know?" Basil shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier bravado evaporating under the collective gaze of the room. She asked about his war service, naturally. But she was more interested in the people around him now, the social connections, the prominent families in the area. He paused, glancing nervously at the Colonel. She seemed particularly curious about Mrs. Carmichael at the old hall. The name fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of surprise through the gathering. Mrs. Carmichael, the wealthy widow who lived in virtual seclusion due to her rheumatism, was hardly the sort of person one would connect with a glamorous young woman from London. Dr. Haydock frowned, his professional instincts clearly puzzled. Mrs. Carmichael, but why on earth would she be interested in my patient? The poor woman hasn't left her house in years. "That's exactly what I wondered," Basil replied. "She asked about Mrs. Carmichael's companion, Miss Finch, how long she'd been there, where she came from originally. She seemed to know quite a bit about the household already." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm, a gesture so slight that only the most observant would have noticed. "How very interesting," she murmured, her mild blue eyes taking on that particular sharpness that suggested her mind was making connections others had missed. "Mr. Blake, when Miss Vane asked these questions, did she seem to be seeking information or confirming what she already suspected?" The distinction was subtle but important, and Basil considered it carefully. "Confirming, I think. She had that way of asking questions where she already knew the answers. Testing to see if I'd tell the truth." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "About what I knew, yes. But I didn't know much about Miss Finch's background. She came to Mrs. Carmichael about 5 years ago, after the old lady's previous companion died. Quiet sort of woman, keeps to herself." Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook, clearly sensing that the case was expanding beyond a simple crime of passion. "We'll need to speak with this Miss Finch and Mrs. Carmichael. If Miss Vane was asking questions about them—" "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "before we go rushing off to disturb an invalid lady, perhaps we might consider what we've learned from this photograph." She picked up the image again, studying it with the careful attention of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The inscription reads June 1953, but as I mentioned earlier, certain details suggest a more recent date. She held the photograph toward the window, where the afternoon light illuminated it clearly. "Look at the woman's hairstyle, Inspector. That particular cut, with the layered sides, didn't become fashionable until the late 50s. And her swimsuit. Note the halter neckline and the way it's constructed. That style wasn't available in 1953. Dolly leaned forward, her earlier distress giving way to fascination. "Then the inscription is false?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "Which raises the question of why someone would want us to believe this photograph represented an old romance between Miss Vane and Colonel Bantry, when in fact it appears to be much more recent." "Someone planted it," Colonel Bantry said grimly. "Someone wanted to implicate me in this woman's death. Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "someone wanted to create a plausible reason for Miss Vane to visit St. Mary Mead, a reason that would focus attention on you, Colonel, while the real purpose of her visit lay elsewhere entirely." The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her thoughts, and the vicar hurried to answer it. He returned moments later, his face pale with concern. "That was Miss Finch at the old hall. She's quite upset. Apparently, someone has been asking questions about Mrs. Carmichael at the post office. A young woman matching Miss Vane's description was there yesterday afternoon, inquiring about deliveries to the house, the staff, their routines." The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, revealing a pattern far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her expression thoughtful. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we may have been looking at this case from entirely the wrong angle. What if Miss Vane didn't come to St. Mary Mead because of something that happened 20 years ago in Cairo? What if she came because of something happening right now in this village involving people we haven't yet considered?" Before Slack could respond, Constable Lake burst through the door with a sort of urgency that suggested news of significant import. "Inspector, we've had a report of a break-in at the old hall. Miss Finch telephoned in hysterics. She says Mrs. Carmichael's private study has been ransacked and several valuable items are missing." The room erupted into a buzz of conversation, but Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her mild blue eyes fixed on a point beyond the window where the shadows were lengthening toward evening. Her expression suggested not surprise at this development, but rather the satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by events, piece by carefully constructed piece. The journey to Old Hall took place in Inspector Slack's motor car, with Miss Marple, Colonel Bantry, and Dolly following in the Colonel's rover through the gathering dusk. The ancient house emerged from behind a screen of elms like a Gothic sentinel, its mullioned windows catching the last rays of September sunlight with an almost accusatory gleam. Miss Finch met them at the heavy oak door, her thin face blotchy with tears, and her hands working a handkerchief into tortured knots. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with a sort of faded prettiness that suggested better days before life had worn down her confidence and expectations. "Oh, Inspector, it's dreadful. Simply dreadful," she gasped, leading them through the dim entrance hall where portraits of long-dead Carmichaels stared down in perpetual disapproval. "Mrs. Carmichael is beside herself. Her private study has been ransacked, and the safe has been forced open." The study itself presented a scene of calculated destruction. Drawers had been pulled from the heavy oak desk and their contents scattered across the Persian carpet like autumn leaves. Books lay splayed open on the floor, their pages fluttering in the draught from the open door. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed something curious about the chaos. The silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece remained untouched, and a valuable carriage clock ticked serenely on a side table. "When did you discover this?" Inspector Slack demanded, his notebook already open. "Just after 3 o'clock. I'd been reading to Mrs. Carmichael in her sitting room, and when I went to fetch her afternoon medicine from the study, I found everything in this state." Miss Finch's voice rose to near hysteria. The French windows were broken, and papers were everywhere. Miss Marple had moved quietly to examine the shattered glass door that opened onto the terrace. The pane near the latch was broken, with shards glittering on both the carpet and the stone terrace outside. She bent to study them with the careful attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "Inspector," she called softly, "might I draw your attention to this glass? Most of it has fallen inside the room, as one would expect from a blow struck from outside. However, there are several large pieces on the terrace itself, which is rather curious." Slack joined her with barely concealed impatience. "Stand at breaking and entering, Miss Marple. Smash the glass to reach the latch." "Yes," she agreed mildly, stepping through the doorway onto the terrace. "But observe the flower bed below. The soil is quite soft from yesterday's rain, yet there isn't a single footprint. Rather remarkable for someone who supposedly approached from the garden." Miss Finch made a small, strangled sound. I raked the beds this morning, after I finished deadheading the roses." "Before or after you discovered the break-in?" Miss Marple asked gently, her mild blue eyes taking on that particular sharpness that suggested careful calculation. "Before. Of course, before." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then bent to retrieve something from among the scattered papers, a small square object that caught the light. "How interesting," she murmured, examining what appeared to be a photographic slide. "Inspector, this looks rather like microfilm, doesn't it?" Before Slack could respond, the sound of wheels on parquet announced a new arrival. Mrs. Carmichael propelled her bath chair into the room with surprising vigor, her iron-gray hair perfectly arranged despite the supposed trauma, her dark eyes blazing with fury that didn't quite mask an underlying current of fear. "Inspector," she declared in a voice that brooked no argument, "I demand to know what you intend to do about this outrage. Thieves in my own home in broad daylight." Miss Marple rose respectfully, still holding the slide. "Mrs. Carmichael, I believe. I'm Miss Marple. Might I ask what sort of documents your late husband kept in his study? This appears to be a photographic record of some kind." The old woman's gaze fixed on the slide with an intensity that suggested recognition. "My late husband was Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office. Naturally, he kept copies of certain correspondence, reports on individuals whose careers intersected with his own." "Including Colonel Bantry's service in Cairo?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. Mrs. Carmichael's eyes flickered toward the Colonel, then back to Miss Marple. "Among others. There were complications during that posting, matters of security that were never fully resolved. The implications hung in the air like smoke." Miss Marple glanced at Miss Finch, who had retreated to the shadows by the window, her hands still working that unfortunate handkerchief. The companion's eyes were fixed on the floor, but her repeated swallowing betrayed a throat grown suddenly dry. "And now," Mrs. Carmichael added with bitter emphasis, "someone has come searching for those old secrets. If they thought to profit from stirring up buried matters, They have made a grave miscalculation indeed. The revelation of Mrs. Carmichael's stolen documents had transformed the investigation from a village scandal into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack's expression suggested a man who had expected to arrest a jealous lover and found himself instead navigating treacherous waters of government secrets and wartime betrayals. Mrs. Carmichael's fingers drummed against the arms of her bath chair with the steady rhythm of a woman accustomed to wielding power from a position of apparent weakness. "Inspector, you must understand that my late husband was not merely a civil servant. During and after the war, he was responsible for monitoring individuals whose loyalties were questionable. The files in that safe contained information that certain people would pay handsomely to suppress." "Blackmail," Colonel Bantry said heavily, the word falling into the room like a stone into still water. "A crude term, Colonel, but accurate," Mrs. Carmichael replied with aristocratic disdain. "Though I prefer to think of it as insurance against future indiscretions, my husband believed that knowledge was the most valuable currency of all." Miss Marple, who had been examining the forced French windows with quiet concentration, looked up with an expression of gentle inquiry. "Mrs. Carmichael, forgive my curiosity, but this safe, was it common knowledge that you kept your late husband's papers there?" "Certainly not. Only myself and Miss Finch knew of its existence, and she has never had the combination." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes shifted to the companion, who had retreated further into the shadows by the window. "Miss Finch, my dear, I couldn't help but notice your hands earlier. For someone who claims to have spent the morning gardening, they're remarkably pristine. No soil beneath the nails, no calluses from handling tools." Miss Finch's hands flew instinctively to her pockets, her face flushing with what might have been embarrassment or fear. "I wore gloves, naturally. Heavy gardening gloves." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed with characteristic mildness, though her tone suggested polite skepticism rather than acceptance. She moved to examine the shattered glass more closely, her keen eyes taking in details that others had missed. "Inspector, might I draw your attention to something rather curious about this break-in?" Slack joined her reluctantly, clearly preferring the dramatic revelations about government secrets to Miss Marple's typically understated observations. "What is it now?" "The glass, Inspector. Most of it has fallen inside the room, as one would expect from a blow struck from outside. However, several large pieces lie on the terrace itself, which suggests the window was broken from within and then damaged further to disguise the true direction of the force." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the damaged safe mechanism, straightened suddenly. "Miss Marple is quite right about the deception, Inspector. This safe wasn't forced at all. The lock mechanism shows clear signs of being opened with the correct combination, then damaged afterward to simulate a break-in. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household had staged the entire scene. But whether to cover their tracks after murdering Lydia Vane or for some other purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. Miss Finch made a small, strangled sound, pressing herself against the window frame as though hoping to merge with the woodwork. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and her eyes darted repeatedly toward the door as if calculating the distance to escape. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the sort of compassionate authority that invited confession, "I believe you knew Miss Vane before she arrived in St. Mary Mead yesterday. The question is not whether you helped her, but why." Before the companion could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps in the entrance hall announced a new arrival. Constable Lake burst into the study, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. "Inspector, we've found something in Miss Vane's handbag, a small notebook hidden in the lining. It contains names, dates, and what appear to be financial transactions. But, sir, there's something else. We've had word from London. Miss Vane wasn't just a secretary at the War Office. According to her supervisor, she'd been conducting unauthorized research into personnel files from the Cairo embassy, specifically looking for individuals who might be susceptible to pressure. The notebook passed from hand to hand, each person examining its contents with growing unease. The neat, feminine handwriting documented a systematic investigation that had taken months to complete, with St. Mary Mead clearly marked as the final destination in a carefully planned campaign. Mrs. Carmichael's face had gone ashen as she read, while Miss Finch swayed visibly, gripping the window ledge for support. In the gathering darkness outside, the wind rattled the damaged French windows like an impatient spirit demanding entry, and somewhere in the shadows of the old hall, the truth waited to be uncovered like a body in a shallow grave. The notebook's pages rustled in the lamplight like autumn leaves, each entry revealing another strand in a web of deception that had been 20 years in the weaving. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read with the careful attention of a scholar examining a particularly complex manuscript, her mild blue eyes taking note of patterns that others might miss. "Inspector," she said quietly, "these financial records suggest something far more systematic than simple blackmail. Look at these regular payments. They've continued for years, always the same amounts, always to the same initials, EF. RM, JH. Her finger traced the neat columns. This represents an ongoing arrangement, not isolated incidents of extortion. Miss Finch had retreated to the shadows by the window, her hands working nervously at the fabric of her dress. The careful composure she had maintained for 5 years as Mrs. Carmichael's companion was crumbling like a wall undermined by persistent rain. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple continued gently, "I believe it's time we discussed who you really are, my dear. You see, when I visited last month to discuss the church bazaar arrangements, I couldn't help but notice the photograph on your dressing table. 2 young girls, clearly sisters, with the same dark eyes and determined chin. One of them bore a striking resemblance to the unfortunate Miss Vane. The confession, when it came, emerged like water from a broken dam. Her name was Lydia Finch," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the damaged French windows. "She was my younger sister. My maiden name was Finch. I only became Finch Harrington when I married briefly after the war. The marriage didn't last, but the name gave me a new identity when I needed one." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his notebook forgotten. "Sisters? Then why the deception? Why didn't she simply visit you openly?" "Because of what happened to our father," Eleanor replied, tears beginning to flow freely now. "Captain James Finch was accused of selling military secrets from the Cairo embassy in 1953. The evidence seemed conclusive. Payments to his account, documents found in his quarters. He was court-martialed in disgrace and died of a heart attack before he could clear his name." Mrs. Carmichael's fingers tightened on her bath chair's armrests until the knuckles showed white. "Your father was a traitor. The evidence was overwhelming." "The evidence was planted," Eleanor cried, turning to face her employer with sudden fury. "Lydia spent years investigating, tracing those payments, following the paper trail. She discovered that someone else had access to Father's quarters, someone who could have placed those documents there. Someone who knew the embassy routines well enough to make Father the perfect scapegoat." Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their gentle rhythm, but her attention was focused entirely on Dr. Haydock, who had been unusually quiet throughout the proceedings. The doctor's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said conversationally, "you served as medical officer at the Cairo embassy during that period, didn't you? You would have had access to all areas of the compound, including the officers' quarters." "Along with dozens of other staff members," Haydock replied curtly, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm not implying anything, Doctor. I'm simply observing that you've been remarkably well informed about the details of Miss Vane's death. You were quite certain about the cause of death before the official examination, and you were very quick to point out the condition of her shoes, almost as if you knew exactly where and how she had died." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Colonel Bantry frowned, his military mind beginning to process the implications. "Haydock, you were the one who insisted she drowned initially, before anyone had properly examined the body. And you mentioned the strangulation marks required considerable strength," Miss Marple added mildly. "Which was quite accurate, though one wonders how you could have observed such details so precisely in the poor light at the mill pond." Dr. Haydock's composure finally cracked. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is preposterous speculation. I've served this community faithfully for 20 years. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "just as you served at the Cairo embassy, until gambling debts forced you to make certain compromises with your loyalty. Lydia discovered the truth, didn't she? She found evidence that you were the real traitor, that you had framed her father to save yourself. She came to my surgery yesterday evening," Haydock said suddenly, his voice hollow with defeat. "She had documents, proof of the payments I'd received, evidence that I'd planted the incriminating papers in her father's quarters. She wanted me to sign a confession to clear her father's name publicly." Eleanor made a small, broken sound. "She was trying to restore our family's honor. That's all she ever wanted. I couldn't let her destroy me," Haydock continued, his professional veneer completely gone now. "I'd built a life here, a reputation. I told her I needed time to consider, asked her to return later. But when she came back, she was impatient, threatening. We struggled and He stopped, his hands shaking violently. Inspector Slack had moved to block the door, while Constable Lake readied his handcuffs. "Dr. Haydock, I'm arresting you for the murder of Miss Lydia Finch, also known as Lydia Vane." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic composure. "The poor girl," she murmured to Eleanor, who was weeping quietly into her hands. "She came so close to achieving justice for your father. At least now his name can be cleared." Mrs. Carmichael sat rigidly in her bath chair, watching the proceedings with the expression of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "My husband's files," she said finally. "He knew the truth all along, didn't he?" "I suspect he did," Miss Marple replied gently. "But perhaps he felt that one man's disgrace was preferable to exposing the broader corruption that might have followed. It was a terrible choice, but not an uncommon one in those complicated times." As the police led Dr. Haydock away and the group began to disperse, Miss Marple paused at Eleanor's side. "My dear," she said softly, "your sister's death was not in vain. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, even when it takes 20 years. Your father's honor is restored, and that's what she would have wanted most." Outside, St. Mary Mead settled back into its evening quiet, the ancient stones of the old hall keeping their secrets as they had for centuries. But in the gathering darkness, justice had finally been served, and the long shadow of an old betrayal had been lifted at last. The arrest of Dr. Haydock should have brought relief to St. Mary Mead, yet Miss Marple found herself unable to share in the general satisfaction that evening. She sat in her neat drawing-room, her knitting forgotten in her lap, while a persistent uneasiness gnawed at her consciousness like a splinter that could not quite be located. Outside, the village settled into its customary evening quiet, but within the cottage's lamplight walls, doubt kept vigil with uncomfortable persistence. The confession had been too convenient, she reflected, turning the day's events over in her mind, with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining a flawed stone. Dr. Haydock's admission of guilt had emerged with suspicious timing, just when the evidence was pointing in uncomfortable directions. More troubling still, his confession had been curiously vague about the actual moment of murder. "We struggled, and before trailing off into horrified silence. A medical man would remember precisely what he had done, or not done, in such a moment. The telephone's insistent ring interrupted her contemplation. Inspector Slack's voice carried an edge of frustration that confirmed her growing suspicions. "Miss Marple, thought you should know. Dr. Haydock has retracted his confession. Claims he was protecting someone, says he was treating Mrs. Price Ridley's gout at the time of the murder. She's confirmed his alibi. Blast the woman. After the call ended, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, her mind cataloguing the inconsistencies that had troubled her throughout the investigation. The photograph with its suspiciously fresh inscription, the staged break-in at Old Hall with its tellingly amateur mistakes. Most significantly, the clean satin shoes on Lydia's feet, shoes that could never have carried her along the muddy path to the mill pond. A soft knock at her door came as no surprise. Miss Marple had been expecting a visitor, though she couldn't have explained precisely why. Eleanor Finch stood on the threshold, her face pale in the lamplight, her hands trembling as they clutched a small object that caught the light, a blue sequin, the sort used on evening gowns. "Miss Marple," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I found this caught on the French window latch at the Old Hall. It's from Lydia's dress, the blue one she wore to meet someone last night." They settled in the small sitting room, and Miss Marple observed with her characteristic attention to detail how Eleanor's hands, supposedly soiled from morning gardening, remained pristine beneath her gloves. No calluses, no ingrained earth beneath the nails, the hands of someone who had spent the morning not in the garden, but carefully staging a deception. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it's time we discussed what really happened yesterday evening. Your sister came to Old Hall, didn't she? Not to see Mrs. Carmichael, but to see you." The confession, when it came, emerged like water from a cracked dam. Lydia had indeed discovered the truth about their father's disgrace, but her investigation had revealed something Eleanor had hoped would remain buried forever. Not just Dr. Haydock's guilt, but Eleanor's own complicity in maintaining the deception that had secured her comfortable position at Old Hall. "She called me a parasite," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Said I was living off the very corruption that had destroyed our father. She had documents, proof that I'd been receiving payments through Mrs. Carmichael's accounts. Money that came from blackmail victims. She threatened to expose everything, to drag our family name through the scandal sheets again." Miss Marple's expression remained compassionate but unwavering. "You met her at the mill pond, wearing her blue dress to confuse any potential witnesses about the time and circumstances. You strangled her with her own scarf, then returned to change her shoes, from the muddy walking boots she'd worn to the meeting to the clean satin pumps that would suggest she'd never walked there at all." "I didn't mean to kill her," Eleanor sobbed. "I only wanted her to understand, to see reason. But she was so determined, so righteous. She said 20 years of comfortable lies were enough, that our father's honor mattered more than my security. And afterward, you staged the break-in to suggest that someone had been searching for incriminating documents, hoping suspicion would fall on Dr. Haydock or another of Mrs. Carmichael's victims." Miss Marple rose with quiet dignity, moving toward the telephone. The poor girl. She came so close to achieving the justice she sought. As she dialed the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar tragedy of families torn apart by old secrets, where love and loyalty could twist into something dark and destructive. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its peaceful existence, unaware that another of its carefully buried truths had finally clawed its way to the surface, demanding acknowledgement in the cold light of justice. The sound of approaching police cars broke the evening stillness, and Eleanor Finch sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the inevitable reckoning that her sister's death had made unavoidable. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage, with considerably less bluster than usual, his expression suggesting a man who had learned uncomfortable lessons about accepting obvious solutions. Eleanor Finch sat beside him in the small drawing room, her hands folded quietly in her lap, the fight having gone out of her entirely during the long night of questioning and confession. "Miss Marple," Slack began with grudging respect, "I'll admit your observations proved more valuable than my initial theories. Perhaps you'd explain to the assembled company exactly how you pieced this together." The vicar, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry had gathered as requested, their faces reflecting the peculiar mixture of relief and lingering shock that follows the resolution of village scandal. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded them with gentle attention. "It was the accumulation of small inconsistencies," she began in her characteristic understated manner. "First, the photograph Dolly discovered seemed too convenient. A perfect motive rooted in the distant past, appearing precisely when needed. The inscription's fresh ink and the swimsuit's modern styling suggested recent manufacture rather than a 20-year-old keepsake." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "I found it among Lydia's belongings at the Red Lion. She'd brought several family photographs as proof of our connection. I altered the inscription to implicate Colonel Bantry, hoping to create a false trail." "Then there were the shoes," Miss Marple continued. "Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned Lydia's fashionable heels, yet after yesterday's heavy rain, the mill path would have been treacherous mud. Clean satin shoes suggested she hadn't walked there herself. Someone had changed them posthumously." Dr. Haydock, released after his alibi was confirmed, shifted uncomfortably. "I should have noticed that detail during my examination." "The staged break-in at Old Hall was equally revealing," Miss Marple observed. "Glass fragments on both sides of the window, no footprints in the soft earth below, and a safe opened with its proper combination, then damaged to simulate forcing. These details pointed to someone with intimate household knowledge." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "Miss Finch has provided a complete confession. She met her sister at the mill pond around 9 o'clock, wearing Lydia's blue dress to confuse potential witnesses about timing. During their argument about the blackmail scheme and their father's disgrace, she strangled Lydia with her own scarf, then returned to change the shoes and stage the break-in." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat awkwardly. "The poor girl was trying to restore her father's honor, and her own sister killed her to protect a comfortable lie." "Fear," Miss Marple said softly, "is quite as dangerous a motive as greed or jealousy." Eleanor had spent 5 years profiting from Mrs. Carmichael's blackmail arrangements, taking payments from the very system that had destroyed her father. When Lydia threatened to expose everything, Eleanor chose preservation over justice. Dolly leaned forward earnestly. "But how did you know Eleanor would come to you with that sequin? That seemed to seal her fate." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held a trace of sadness. "Guilt is a terrible burden, my dear. Eleanor needed someone to understand, to witness her confession. By bringing me evidence she claimed to have just discovered, she was actually seeking absolution through revelation. Her knowledge of when and where Lydia wore that particular dress betrayed intimate involvement in the crime." Eleanor spoke suddenly, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't plan to kill her. I only wanted her to understand, to stop threatening everything I'd built. But she was so determined, so righteous about Father's memory. In that moment, I chose myself over her. And now justice must take its course," Inspector Slack said firmly, rising to escort Eleanor to the waiting police car. After they departed, the small group sat in contemplative silence. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its peaceful existence, unaware that another of its carefully buried secrets had been exposed to the harsh light of truth. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with practiced ease. "Human nature," she reflected, "remains remarkably consistent whether in Cairo or an English village. The same small vanities, the same large fears, the same capacity for both nobility and betrayal within a single family." Colonel Bantry stood extending his hand gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your attention to those small details saved me from considerable embarrassment." "Details are everything, Colonel. A woman's shoes, a photograph's anachronisms, the pattern of broken glass. They tell us more than grand theories about passion and revenge." As evening approached and the visitors departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. Somewhere, a young woman had died seeking justice for her father's ruined reputation. Somewhere else, that father's name would finally be cleared of false charges. Between those 2 points lay all the tangled threads of love, loyalty, and moral compromise that comprised ordinary human existence. The church bells began their evening call, their familiar sound drifting across the village like a benediction. Miss Marple folded her work and prepared for tea, knowing that tomorrow would bring new observations, new insights into the endlessly fascinating complexity of human behavior. In St. Mary Mead, there was always another mystery waiting to unfold. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor Finch's arrest, and autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of a season that understood the necessity of both decay and renewal. The scandal had rippled through the village like stones cast into still water, each circle of gossip expanding and diminishing until the surface grew calm again, though perhaps not quite as smooth as before. Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden on a particularly fine October afternoon, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm while she observed the village's gradual return to its customary patterns. The late roses nodded drowsily in the mild breeze, their petals beginning to brown at the edges with the dignified resignation of beauty acknowledging its season's end. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as they had taken to doing since the resolution of the case. The photograph that had caused such domestic upheaval lay once again on the small garden table between them, though now it seemed merely a piece of cardboard rather than the instrument of torture it had appeared to be that morning when Dolly had attempted its destruction. "It's extraordinary how quickly people adjust their memories," Dolly observed, pouring tea with steady hands. "Mrs. Price Ridley was telling me yesterday that she had always thought Eleanor Finch had something shifty about the eyes. Yet only last month she was praising her as the most devoted companion poor Mrs. Carmichael could have hoped for." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle smile. People's recollections have a remarkable capacity for rearrangement when their self-esteem requires protection. It's far more comfortable to believe one has always suspected the worst than to admit to having been completely deceived by someone one saw daily for years. The Colonel shifted in his chair, his expression troubled. Poor devil of a father, to be framed by a colleague's greed and then have his daughters pay such different prices for his vindication. One seeking truth at any cost, the other choosing security over justice. Eleanor made a series of choices, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, counting stitches with practiced precision. First to accept money she knew came from questionable sources, then to preserve that comfortable life when threatened with exposure. Each decision led naturally to the next. One rarely steps into serious wrongdoing through a single dramatic leap. It's more often a progression of small, seemingly reasonable compromises. A comfortable silence settled over the garden, broken only by the distant sound of children playing and the soft rustle of leaves beginning their autumn migration. The village had processed another scandal through its eternal machinery of tea tables and garden conversations, gradually absorbing the shock until it became simply another layer in the accumulated history of human frailty and folly. Dr. Haydock had quietly departed for London, where inquiries into his wartime conduct would proceed with bureaucratic thoroughness. Mrs. Carmichael remained in increasingly isolated splendor at Old Hall, her blackmail files confiscated and her power evaporated like morning mist. The invalid widow had discovered that fortresses built from other people's secrets could very quickly become prisons when those secrets were exposed to daylight. Dolly rose suddenly, the photograph trembling slightly in her hands. "I tried to burn this when I first found it," she said softly, "because I was afraid of what it might mean. Now I think I should burn it to honor what it actually represented. A sister's desperate attempt to protect herself by destroying an innocent man's reputation." She walked to the small garden incinerator and struck a match with decisive movements. The photograph caught quickly, the image of the laughing young woman seeming to dance briefly in the flames before curling into ash. The forged inscription vanished along with the false history Eleanor had tried to create, leaving only the truth of a tragedy that had consumed an entire family across 2 decades. "There," Dolly said, dusting her hands with finality. "Now we can truly put this behind us." Miss Marple watched the last wisps of smoke dissipate into the clear autumn air. She knew that St. Mary Mead would indeed return to its familiar rhythms of church bazaars and charity committees, garden parties and gentle gossip. The surface would once again appear smooth and respectable, reflecting only the most pleasant aspects of village life. But she also understood, with the accumulated wisdom of decades spent observing human behavior, that the capacity for both nobility and betrayal lay not in foreign conspiracies or dramatic passions, but in the quiet, beating hearts of ordinary people, living ordinary lives. Evil rarely announced itself with theatrical flourishes. More often it came wearing sensible shoes and carrying a shopping basket, saying good morning very politely while concealing terrible secrets behind a facade of respectability. As the church bells began their evening call, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return indoors. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new opportunities to study the endlessly fascinating complexity of human nature in all its contradictory glory. In St. Mary Mead, there was always another mystery waiting to unfold beneath the tranquil surface of village life. Another truth waiting to be teased from the fabric of ordinary existence by patient observation and an understanding heart. The village slept peacefully that night, unaware that its most perceptive resident remained wakeful, her mild blue eyes already noting the peculiar expression that had crossed the postmaster's face during evening service, wondering with characteristic curiosity what small drama might next disturb the deceptive calm of their little community.